Sam Bradshaw breaks down the trends, looks at the evidence, and then also starts yet another. Okay, how does someone else attack each other, in this case TCU and Baylor? Sam, I'll start with this, and thank you as always for being a part of the show. So TCU shut down what is a pretty potent Baylor running attack. We know Baylor, that's what Texas running attack. We know that's what Baylor needs to do. What gives?
I think they had a great game plan for Texas, kept a lot of the deep shots that Texas uses to get a little bit of a pressure relief off of what they're doing in the run game. So if you try and outnumber them, that's kind of their counter. They had a good game plan for handling that. So they were able to do a few things that other teams really haven't been able to do to the Longhorns. TCU's got a good defense. They returned an awful lot at the secondary level and at the linebacker level from what Gary Patterson recruited to. And under a new coordinator, they were able to add some true kind of 3-4 style nose guards, 3 of them, between the transfer portal and a high school recruit who's come on pretty strong for them. And the combination has really revitalized the defense that was struggling this time last year.
Sam, what do you think that TCU will do differently against Baylor that they may have done against Texas to spark their offense a little bit more?
Well, first off, I think Duggan played beneath what he's used to against Texas. I feel like he missed a lot of throws, and I feel like they let Texas get them off schedule to a certain degree. They didn't block very well when they had even numbers. And some of the tendencies they were giving, I feel like Texas had a pretty good read on, and they were able to do some things based off of that. So I think you'll get a better game from TCU in terms of execution than you got last week, but I also think that's going to be true of Baylor on both sides of the ball.
Sam, everything was bad for Baylor last week, basically. What was the worst?
What was the worst for me is in the first half, you gave up over 60 yards a drive, and 70% of your third down opportunities were converted on either third down or fourth down. As a defense, you can't persist in doing that. I'm glad that they forced 1.5 third down opportunities per drive. I'm glad that they limited big plays, but you've got to get off the field, or else all you're doing is wearing out your defense and not giving your offense a chance to get into a rhythm. I mean, you only had 4 drives in the first half. It's the exact opposite of what we saw in the Bryles years where everyone's like, the defense is so bad, blah, 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 blah. No, the total yards are high because you had so many drives. In this case, the total yards on both sides of the ball were so low because you only had 75% of the drives that a typical game would have.
Sam, that's a great question, Craig. What was the worst? Oh, my goodness. Did that just blow you out of the water, that performance?
It was extremely disappointing, but I think the most maddening aspect of it, as somebody pulling for Baylor, is that the defense, they would get them to third down. They would limit the big plays that K-State was exceptional at coming in, but they just wouldn't get off the field. So it was this constant, you're almost there, but no. You're almost there, but no. And then on the offensive side, it was a more muted version of what we saw from the 2011 team when they went up to Oklahoma State, where they just moved the ball up and down the field in that one, but just petered out in the red zone. They didn't move it as well in this, but I mean, around 33 yards a drive, which is not bad. I mean, it's not great, but it's not bad. But when you have 4 scoring opportunities, 3 of them in the red zone, and you come away with 3 points from that, that's not going to win you a whole lot of games, getting basically very inefficient conversion from your opportunities into points. You've got to cash in when you have a chance, and the offense wasn't able to do that. Chapin was a little off. The penalties were bad. They weren't blocking exceptionally well. The receivers were dropping. It was just a disjointed performance, and I expect we'll see a lot better execution, win or lose, against TCU.
Yeah, Sam, they've had games this year where one thing wasn't working and another thing was, but this one was everything not working. Do you expect to see more of a look at Richard Reese this week? Do they go back to Squirrel Williams, or was that more or less the offensive line not playing well?
I think it was a good game plan by KSU more than the offensive line, more than which back you had in. I feel like they did a good job on early downs of trying to run blitz and inflict negative plays to scare you away from leaning on the run game. And to a certain degree, Baylor did not commit to the run game as a result of it, so it obviously worked. So I think Baylor's going to have to be a little more intentional with sticking with the run. I think whether it's Squirrel, whether it's Reese, whether it's Quaylen, you've got to be intentional about sticking with it. And, that's more of a scheme thing. And you've got to be able to do some things to use the full arsenal of your run plays. Because this, to quote the Ole Miss DC from last year, he basically equated this offense to like a run-based version of the air raid, where they have their set of plays, everything builds off of each other. If they're camping out on something else is open. You've got to get to that part of your offense.
So why was that not happening for Blake Shapen? How much, okay, it's always the quarterback's fault when anything goes wrong, basically, no matter what it may be. But, I mean, this has been the kind of year that, I think a lot of Baylor fans weren't expecting, just because of the fact that we saw Shapen play pretty sharp. And, of course, teams get film on him and so on and so forth. And for all we know, he could be banged up a little bit as well. I mean, there's a lot of wild cards, but not knowing exactly what those are, Sam, what do you see from Blake Shapen? What did you see last week, and how can he be better this Saturday?
He was certainly throwing high against K-State. He's had a lot of interceptions. Generally speaking, he's definitely had a couple clunkers of decisions contribute to a couple of those. But for the most part, the decision on where to go with the ball is not really been his problem. It's either been inaccurate throws or drops or bad ball security on fumbles. With him against K-State, his mechanics were a little off. He was thrown high, and it led to some drops, and it was just a disjointed performance. If he just settles down, gets back to what we've seen him do before. You don't pull off what he did against Oklahoma State without being in control of your mechanics. You don't pull that off without being at least serviceable in that regard. You've got the ability to do an awful lot with that kid, and I think he'll grow from it. But people also got to remember, this is a kid that, he's in his second year effectively playing, but really his first full year playing. Colt McCoy ended up being a really, really good quarterback for the University of Texas. But you go back to some of the games in 2006 and 2007, Longhorn fans were just raking him over the coals online about, well, you played terrible against this K-State game. You played terrible in this game, that game, And then the kid eventually developed out of it. I think we'll see some similar level of growth to Blake. I'm not saying he's going to be all Big 12. I'm not saying he's going to eventually play in the NFL. But what I'm saying is, you're going to have the opportunity to see a lot of development as a kid.
Daniel Acton on the chat room. I just saw this. Please ask Sam if he has noticed if the officials are calling fewer offensive holding calls this year in college football.
I really haven't been tracking it. I haven't been charting for that. But the thing people got to understand on holding, and back in high school, I actually played on the offensive line. And the thing that coaches would kind of give a barometer, because the old adage, you can call holding on every play, it tends to be that if you're defining it by grabbing somebody's jersey at any point, you could call holding on any play. But generally, if you're inside the armpits holding somebody, they'll let you get away with that. It's when you bear hug, or when you don't let go if they're pulling away from you, like they're going in the opposite direction to pursue, and you don't let go. It's things like that that usually get the calls. And Baylor's played a lot of veteran offensive lines. Guys that know just enough to get away with it without drawing the flag. So I think there's a certain degree of that going into it. And obviously I haven't charted it. I don't know the stats on whether or not I think it's fair or not compared to prior years. But, teams are going to do what they're going to do. You got to live with the calls either way. And, if they're getting away with something, why aren't we?
Do you feel like special teams has taken a little bit of a step back this season? At least,
is it a step back, or is it
punting,
more of a revealing?
Punting in particular.
With kickoff coverage, you basically had the last couple of years a guy that can boot it through the end zone whenever you need him to, and for the most part, they've let him do that. Why they decided not to do that against Oklahoma State and probably cost Baylor a loss, I don't know. So that one, I don't know if that's necessarily a step back, but more just seeing what was there that you got away with not having to see. Punt returns, against K-State, that wasn't great, but K-State's also an outstanding punt return team. Phillip Brooks is outstanding. and they block for him really well. There's a lot of good returners out there who don't have good blocking in front of them. K-State makes sure that Brooks has an escort that's really efficient. So I definitely think that your coverage units have suffered this year, whether that's a regression or just a combination of actually dealing with kickoff coverage and facing some good punt return units. That's one I go back and forth on.
Darius Davis is one that doesn't need any help, right?
Absolutely. And, even having to play their backup quarterback for most of the game, if he doesn't make that return, Texas Tech probably has a decent chance to potentially beat TCU down the stretch, but he absolutely tilted that game. He's tilted some other games for him. And in terms of team speed, not just Davis, not just Barber, not just Johnston, not just Kendre Miller, just even on the defensive side in the secondary and at linebacker, TCU is one of the teams on Baylor's schedule that's probably got as much team speed as anybody you're going to face all year. If you're doing a 4x100 relay of all the Big 12 teams in terms of just track speed, Baylor and TCU are both very up there in terms of just guys that can fly. So you've got a lot of guys to watch out for in terms of big plays. Davis is chief among them, but Johnston, Miller, all kinds of dudes left and right can make a house call from a long range. And, TCU, I forget if it's 40 yards or 50 yards, but percentage of plays going for that distance. As of like a week or two ago, I think TCU was number one in the country on that. So extremely explosive offense ahead of you. And as you mentioned with Davis, punt returns deadly there too.
Kendre Miller went 75 yards, and it kind of popped that game open a little bit and outran some dudes in the Texas secondary, and a couple of them had an angle on him, and that was kind of surprising. I knew he was good, but I didn't know he was that fast, and you're right. So he just proved that they can go 75 at any moment, and that's my question. Baylor, do they have some? Squirrel had the long run that sealed the game. Richard Reese can fly. Obviously, Monterey Baldwin can fly. Gavin Holmes can fly. But do they have that kind of dynamic playmaker like we might see 3 or 4 of them on the TCU offense?
I think they've got guys that when you get them into the open field, their track speed will take over. What I think is a little slower to develop is finding guys that can get into the open, getting them open on those routes, getting them to get that initial separation with the short area quickness. Some of that is a little lagging, but you get Squirrel Williams in the open field, you're not catching him. You get Gavin Holmes and Monterey Baldwin some opportunities to get in the open field with some momentum behind them. West Virginia and Oklahoma State can tell you how that works out. And speaking of West Virginia, one stat that jumped out to me during the prep for this week, I think West Virginia was 115th in the country in terms of 20-plus yard plays given up. TCU's right there with them. So while TCU's defense is good, there's the opportunity to pop some plays against these guys.
Sam, thank you very much. Appreciate your time. It ought to be interesting to see what, without the X's and O's or whatever, what's in between someone's chest. And Baylor, do they have that ability to bounce back after what was a dumpster fire game against Kansas State? Is that going to be in their heart and soul tomorrow? And that still may not be enough, but they will have to bring every ounce of that. Thanks for your time. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
That's Sam Bradshaw. Boy, Sam just dissects it. So many people on SicEm365 in the forum section, the premium section, do that every single week.
Yeah,